Perloff lecture series celebrating 100 years of transportation research at UCLA. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Gabrielino Tonga people, the traditional land caretakers of Tavonga, which are in the Los Angeles basin and the Southern Channel Islands. And so as a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukvetum, the ancestors, the elders, and our relatives' relations, past, present, and emerging. And thanks so much to the Harley Perloff Endowment for funding for this series. So we are as people in this room know, people online may not, we're the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. And this year we are celebrating 100 years of transportation research here at first what was the southern branch of the University of California, and now is the University of California, LA. So we started in the 1920s looking at street traffic, expanded to do things like crash testing with crash test dummies, and then into engineering. And there's a little lull. And then more recently, we've shifted to the social and behavioral aspects of travel, and then even more recently, part of a multidisciplinary, multi-campus statewide research consortium. So it's been going on for a long time, and hopefully we'll have another 100-year celebration long after I'm gone. This year, we also set up a new Center for Parking Policy, and for folks online, we'd love to have your support on that. But more importantly today, I want to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Giuliano, who is a distinguished professor at, it's in the UK, in the House of Commons, and they're not allowed to mention the House of Lords by name. They have to talk about the other place. So I do want to welcome John Giuliano, who is a distinguished professor at the other place, the other university, and is also former dean of the Price School there at USC. She has done work on areas that are too many to list, but I think more recently, much of her most interesting work has been in the area of freight, which is perhaps the understudied aspect of transportation, both online shopping behavior and how that affects freight demand, but also questions of reducing the environmental impacts of truck traffic. She also has way too many accolades and honors to read right now, but they include the Thomas Dean Distinguished Lectureship Award at the Transportation Research Board, Distinguished Contribution Awards from the Council of University Transportation Centers, and the Walter Izard Award for Distinguished Scholarship in Regional Science. She's also originally a historian, I found out, and so I think there's no better person to close out our lecture series by talking about how the past may define the future of LA Transit. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now let's see if it works and if I have the right direction here. Yes, that's very good. First of all, thank you all for inviting me here. I've been to UCLA a lot. Back in the old days, believe it or not, the two planning schools used to get together once a year so that all the faculty could just hang out together. And I think that was before the traffic got as bad as it is, maybe. But we have actually lots of long-term relationships, even though we don't talk about each other's schools, right? Many of my co-authors have UCLA affiliations. Okay, that said, I'm going to kind of give you a warning here. There's nothing new or brilliant in what I'm going to say today. Basically, I'm going to, my message I could probably present in 5 minutes, which is that the built environment hangs around for a very long time. And as a result, spatial structure doesn't change very much. And so whenever we're thinking about transit, higher, sorry.
Bit closer to your mouth.
Up there, is that better? Should it be the other way?
Yeah, maybe on the other. Gotta get her.
This way? Would that be better?
Yeah, it sounds good to me.
Okay. Well, nobody missed anything anyway. Okay, so I'm going to talk basically about three things. The first thing is about what are the main factors that determine transit demand. And all of you already know this, so this is going to be the reminder. I'm going to talk about a history of some trends, and then I'm going to kind of give you what I'm calling the balance sheet. So if we put everything together, where do we land in terms of the future of transit in LA? So what are the four things? Oh dear, didn't translate well. Sorry for the slides here. The four things are up there, right? The first thing that I would say is a really big, important factor in transit use is the geography. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But geography explains an awful lot about why, LA is different from Dallas, is different from Chicago. The second thing is population, meaning population characteristics. What is the population like? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The third thing is economy in terms of what is the economic structure of the region, what types of jobs are there, and how are those jobs changing. And then the third one is public policy. And that's the thing I think I will probably speak least about today because that's a lecture all in itself. Okay, let's start talking about geography. And the story here, and this is my own photo, by the way, from the tallest building in Seoul. You can go to the top, and then you can take a picture of the city. So if there's density, if you ever want to see it. And we know that transit really works best when we have a high density of destination concentrations, downtowns, very powerful sort of downtowns that dominate the region, major employment or activity clusters, and so on. We also know that it helps to have high density corridors where there are very high volume flows. And transit works even better the worse traffic congestion that there is, right? Because that's when we have a travel time advantage. In terms of origin concentrations, you can see, for example, here in Seoul, much of the residential construction is very high towers. So we've got huge amounts of trip generation in a very small area. Now I want to talk about LA County. And I'm going to show you first, I'm going to talk about employment in LA County first, and then I'll talk about population. So I want you to stare at this map. It's very hard to actually get historical data on employment because the sources change all the time and the way that employment data is collected all the time. So just for the purpose of this, I decided to use LEHD data. The very earliest we have at the county, at the census tract level, is 2002. So I want you to stare at that map. The darker colors are higher density, okay? Now I want you to stare at this one. And this is 2020, okay? And how many of you see any difference between B and A? Okay? And that's really the big point here, is that to the naked eye, you can't even tell how much has changed in a 20-year period. And that's saying something. Here are the numbers to give you a little sense. So here we are in at least in roughly 20 years. Total employment has gone up a fair bit, right? From 3.8 million to 4.4 and 4.5 million. The average densities are low because I've included the entire county, right? So don't really pay much attention to that. What I have then next is what is the 90th percentile employment population in the 2 years? And what share of all the employment does that account for? So in the 90th percentile, right, we go from about 7,800 jobs per square mile to about 82 over that period. And we have roughly the same percentage of jobs in that category. If I ratchet up to 95%, the 95th percentile, which is what I have used in the past as one of the indicators of what we call employment centers, then the employment density goes up quite a bit from 13,000 to 14,000. And about a little over 25%, right? Between 25 and 30% of all the employment in the entire region, in the entire county, is accounted for in those zones that are in that highest density, okay? So obviously, employment is very concentrated, okay? And it has increased in concentration somewhat over those 20 years. So if I have a fixed geography and if any growth happens, it has to be true that density is going to go up, right? So there's that, right? And since there's far less employment than population, the average employment densities are lower than the average population densities, as I will show you. And I will also show you that employment is far more concentrated than population. So the kind of bottom line here is that things are gradually getting more dense, but the structure is pretty much the same. And those employment concentrations where they are quite stable. Let me talk a little bit more about employment concentration. This is an area in which I've done a lot of work over the years. I've done a lot of work looking at what we call employment centers, spent a lot of time figuring out why they should exist and what function they have in the economy. And just kind of as a reminder, none of that employment would be concentrated if it wasn't worth it, because that concentration is an indicator of higher land values. So nobody's going to pay higher rents unless there's something in it for them, right? And that something is agglomeration economies, which comes in basically 3 packages. One is being able to share resources. So for example, the same internet system, the same infrastructure. Another one is matching, in terms of being able to better match the demands of a given company with the labor supply. And learning, meaning the sharing of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge. So despite everything that's happened over the last many, many decades, agglomeration economies are still alive and a driving force in urban structure. Now, of course, employment concentration can take a lot of different forms, right? And the form that you're probably most familiar with is the traditional monocentric city, as in a New York or a Paris or a Tokyo. That's where there's one center that accounts for a large proportion of all the employment, and therefore exhibits a lot of impact on its surrounding area, okay? The other version is where we live, and that's polycentricity, where there is no dominant center. We have a downtown Los Angeles, but the West Side has more jobs than downtown Los Angeles has. And if I go further south into Orange County, the Irvine, Santa Ana area has as many jobs or more as downtown Los Angeles. So we clearly have a very polycentric urban form here. And the other kind of comparables are actually places that are like the Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp area, where there's a lot of interaction between these centers at approximately, in similar scale to what we have in Los Angeles. So I want to just show you just a couple pictures of employment centers just to let you know a little bit about them. We define or we conceptualize employment centers as a cluster of economic activity that has sufficient magnitude to actually influence land prices and therefore urban form. That's the easy part. The hard part is how do you measure them? And there's literally been about 20, 30 years worth of debate over how this should be done. My colleague Ken Small and I started, we're in the debate in the 1990s, believe it or not. And the simple-minded way that we decided to define centers, which was any collection of areas that has at least 10,000 jobs and a density of over the 95th percentile of job density, seems to work really well, especially if you want to look at longitudinal data. And here is some longitudinal data that we have worked on, me and others, over various years. And this is my story here about how LA has been polycentric for a long time. And also, it's remarkably stable. Now, there's no way to do this with the same data. So there are different data sources here because they've changed so much over the years. So there's kind of limited comparability from year to year, but it's all that we really have. But if you look at, for example, the SCAG 1980, the SCAG 1990, the SCAG 2000, those are all data sets that are pretty much collected in the same way. So those are pretty comparable. Then for 2010, SCAG wasn't doing this anymore in the same way, so we used LEHD. But just take a look here, and what you see is that the number of centers has increased over time, more or less, right? The share of employment in these centers has been pretty constant over a very long period of time, right? So 32% or 40%, depending on how you count, in 1980. And here we are at 36% in 2010. The other striking thing is that this takes up very little of the square miles of the region. Now, this is the SCAG region, it's not just LA County. So we're looking at 30–40% of all the employment in the entire region in somewhere between 2 and 4% of all the land area. So that's amazing kind of concentration. Okay. This is just one picture, and I'm hoping that your memory is good enough to remember those graphics that I showed you earlier. And you can see right here, this is where you saw the density in LA County. These are colored because one of the projects that we did was to look at the function of different types of centers. Do they serve different functions in the space economy? The answer is yes. And that's why there's colors here. But for our purposes, that's not important. What's important is approximately this is what you have, whether it's 1980 or 2024. Okay. Okay, so what does all this mean for public transportation? I'm going to argue that employment is a pretty good proxy for overall travel demand, right? Whether it's shopping or restaurants or school or employment, it's a pretty good proxy. And so what we know here is that while we have these amazing concentrations, there's not anything that's dominant. And so there's no central focus for the network. Now, if you all have in your heads a map of LA Metro, the rail lines, you'll know that it's focused on downtown LA, right? and it has spokes coming in from every direction into downtown LA. That's not what the structure is here, right? The structure here is much more spread out. If you don't have a single dominant concentration, then you don't have a central focus for the network. You have to move towards something that's closer toward a grid pattern. And that means you're going to have more miles of routes. It means that you're going to have less volumes of routes. And so it's going to be higher costs to serve. Okay. Now let's go to population. And we do have population all the way back to 1980. So you get another visual test here. This is 1980, and the darker blue is the higher density. In all these maps, by the way, the density categories are exactly the same, okay? So that will help you. So here's 1980. Here's 2000. And here's 2020. Okay, so what do you see? There's an increase, and it's sort of filling up the middle, right? And the valley is filling up, okay? So now look at some numbers. So here's our population. 1980 population for the county was about 7.5 million. 2020, about 10 million. So pretty good increase in population over those 40 years. Average population density has definitely gone up. Now look at the 90% population, the 90 percentile of population is really high, right? At 16,000, 24,000, 26,000. So we've got some pockets of very high population density, right? But the share of population in that 10 percentile is actually very small. So we're talking 12% down to 9% by 2020. Okay, so we've got big pockets, but not a lot of people live in these high density pockets. And there's fewer people living in them over time. So the population is obviously a lot more distributed than employment. So again, density has got to go up. We have a fixed geography here. So over time, as the population grows, it is going to get more dense. For sure, within the 90th percentile, that 90th percentile is getting more dense, right? So is everything else, right? Let's see. I don't want to. I don't want to go into that. Things are pretty stable. But I guess the bottom line is, although the share in highest density tracts is not increasing, the number of people living in them, of course, is increasing because we have greater population, right? But that number of people is not increasing as much as the people who are not living within that 90th percentile. So we have the peanut butter effect, which you saw in the pictures, right? Okay, some numbers, no. So where we've gotten so far, right, is that the geographic structure of employment is extremely consistent over a very long period of time. The population is increasing, but it's not changing very much in terms of where it is, okay? That's a lot to say over 40 years. I mean, that's a long time period, right? And I wanted to kind of just remind you of some of the things that have happened in that 40 years that could be very dislocating, right? So the first one is that as the region as a whole over that 40 years went from 10.7 million people to 18.7 million people. And jobs increased roughly 5.4 million to 8.1 million. So that's the whole region. That's a huge amount of growth, right? Secondly, We've had several very significant financial crises. I don't think anybody in this room is old enough to remember the 1980s S&L financial crisis. That was similar to 2008, except that it was triggered by over lending and high risk lending in the savings and loan market. It had the same effect of a real estate crash, lots of bankruptcies, lots of foreclosures, and lots of sort of restructuring as a result. 2008, most of you in this room lived through that one. And that again was a hugely, dislocating event. Sharp increase in unemployment, sharp decrease in family incomes, lots and lots of changes, okay? There's also been a great deal of what we would call economic restructuring. In the 1990s, prior to the 1990s, the Los Angeles region was a major center for the aerospace industry. But the reductions in military spending and a lot of other public policies resulted in a huge decline in those industries, along with much of the region's manufacturing industry. So that was a big restructuring. Another big trend has been the tremendous increase in international trade, starting in the 1990s. The ports of LA and Long Beach were not always the largest ports in the United States. New York, New Jersey was for many, many years. And so that spawned a whole new kind of industry related to international trade. And then more recently, we've seen the emergence of high-tech industry clusters here. For example, Silicon Beach, okay? So there's been a lot of churning within the economy over this period of time. We've also experienced a whole lot of technological change. I've just listed some things there, but in the 1980s, we didn't have the internet. Desktops were a big deal. Laptops were brand new. And high-speed computing didn't exist. So a lot of technology, which affects the way people behave and run their daily lives, has also changed over that time. So that's a lot to think about in terms of having such a stable spatial environment. Okay, let's move now to population characteristics. And again, this is old news for all of you in this room, but I think it's kind of worth thinking about how these trends actually can be influential in terms of how we think about the market for public transit. So you all know this. You know that lower income households use transit more. You know that single people and households without kids are going to use transit more. You know that young people use transit more. And when people get old enough, they don't use transit because it's so difficult to use. And households with more cars use transit less. So we know all that stuff. But the interesting thing is, how are those trend lines moving, right, historically? So again, because the US Census became the ACS, some of this stuff is hard to compare over a long period of time. But here's just some numbers. So you can see that median household income, this is constant dollars, hasn't really moved much. 2010 was the result of the Great Recession, and things have recovered. We've seen some progress in terms of households below the poverty level. And we've seen some slight progress or some slight change in terms of the share of households with no vehicles, okay? So just sort of remember those. We're going to come back. Household composition. This was very difficult to try to put anything together between 1990 and 2024. But the important things are, if you look at the percent changes there, what we've seen is a substantial decline in the share of married couples. We've seen an even more substantial decline in married couples with kids. We've seen this huge increase in other family households. That's because the counting changed. Because back in the old days, in 1990, the only kind of single family household that was counted was women. There were only female-headed households, but there was no calling out of male-headed households. So now the 2024 numbers include one-parent households that are both male and female. That's why that has changed so much. Non-family households have increased a little bit, and so on. So think about where the market is for public transit and where these trends are going. Here's the age distribution. And remember, we said that young people are more likely to use transit. I threw everybody from 18 to 34 into one group. The usual category is 18 to 24. But since household formation is delayed, is becoming something that happens in people's older life, I decided to be liberal here. But you can see that that particular cohort, which would be a transit market cohort, is going down. Okay, in terms of the economy, I've already talked about agglomeration. But the thing about economy that's important to think about is that jobs with fixed schedules are going to be more easily served with transit, right? Jobs that also, on the other hand, jobs that can be done virtually are going to reduce the transit market. So depending on how work life goes, right, we could have some big influences there. The other part is job tenure. We know for sure that shorter job tenure reduces options for people to live and work near transit. So if you're in a world where you're going to be in one job this year and another job next year and another job the year after that, it's unlikely that you're going to move 3 times. You're going to be satisfied if you can get to the job, okay? The other part of this is the rise, and by the way, job tenure has not changed much in this period of time. But what has changed is the rise of the gig economy. And so what we're seeing is a larger share of self-employment and a larger share of casual types of jobs. And those are all the kinds of jobs that are going to be harder most of the time to serve by transit. This is my one slide on transportation policy, just to let you know that I'm aware of it. Because we could, as I said, that's the subject of another lecture. But we do know that public policy has a tremendous impact on whatever we're doing out there in the world of travel. The infrastructure investments we've made have been public policy decisions. The way we tax to finance them are public policy decisions. The way that we manage the car are all public policy decisions. The extent to which we prioritize transit, these are all policy decisions. The same is true on the land use side. We can use zoning, we can use incentives, we can do all kinds of things that can either incentivize certain kinds of development or disincentivize certain kinds of development. And more recently, we have a spate of state regulations, right, that are aimed at trying to achieve these higher density goals. Okay, that's my one slide on policy. Now I want to go to where we are in terms of trends. So this is the journey to work mode choice from between 2010 and 2024. This is ACS data. And what do you see here? This is 2010, this is 2024. So amazingly enough, drive alone has gone down. and substantially gone down, okay? What's the result here? Work at home. Work at home has increased dramatically. Public transit share has gone down, carpool has gone down. So those are the sort of under those trends that in the drop in carpooling and the drop in public transit have been long trends, right? But this recent change, in recent meaning 15 years, right? We've finally gotten people out of their cars to go to work, and how have we done that? By letting them work at home, right? Okay. So here's the balance sheet. And well, all that I did was think about what's on the plus side for a future of more use of public transit and what's on the negative side, okay? And so on the plus side in the geography category is, of course, that it's going to help that population is still growing and employment is still growing in LA County, and therefore everything is getting more dense. So that's going to help. To some extent, having employment concentrated is going to help. The west side, as a big job center, right, is going to attract an awful lot of trips. On the population side, the fact that we have fewer households with kids is probably a positive, right? Because it's much more difficult to travel around with your kids than not. And households with kids have much more complicated decisions, activity decisions to make. Also more single households for the same reason. And another plus on the economy side is the continued value of agglomeration economies. These huge job concentrations are not going to go away. They've been here for 40 years. They'll probably be here for another 40. On the negative side is the fact that while it's great that population density is increasing, it's, again, kind of this peanut butter effect. And it would be much more helpful, right, if it were more concentrated. Employment centers are the negative side also because it's so hard to create a high quality grid transportation system, transit system. In terms of population, higher incomes, more car ownership, fewer young people, more really old people, none of that bodes well for public transportation. And then on the economy side, if this trend continues in terms of being able to work remotely or work at Starbucks or wherever you want to work, right? If that becomes a growing share of the economy, then we just have fewer people who are demanding the kind of service that transit provides. Okay. Now you asked me to talk about the future, right? So another thing we have to think about is what do we see happening in the future? So this is not a priority list. This is just a few ideas that I came up with. The first one on the list is automated vehicles, right? We have Waymo zipping around as we speak. The interesting thing about Waymo is that a profitable use case has yet to be demonstrated. So Waymo is not making any profit running those cars all over the place, in part because those cars are costing hundreds of thousands of dollars because of all the technology, and also all of the backroom system management that has to happen for those cars to operate. So Waymo is another taxi. That's all it is. Hard, but perhaps at some point it will be a use case, but yeah, it doesn't seem to be terribly promising. And if all it's going to do is provide more taxi service, that's not going to change anything, right? The other thing that people talk a lot about with automation is shared mobility. I don't have time to go into this in any detail, but if you look at things like the trends in carpooling or anything else, it's very difficult to think that large numbers of people would want to share their rides with other strangers at the very base of that market. The second thing is electrification of the transport sector. This doesn't seem like it would change anything because what we're really doing is just substituting a new fuel in the existing technology, right? So it's all about people, instead of having their ICE cars, they now have their Tesla cars. But the cars themselves are still the car and they're still being used in basically the same way. One of the economic restructuring things that's happening is the decline of the entertainment industry in the county. But as I pointed out to you, we've gone through many major restructurings and not a lot has changed. There's also climate change. And one of the things we're thinking about is the increase in damages that climate change is generating in terms of major events and so on. And that it may have a very indirect effect in the sense that this is costing a great deal of public money and insurance money. And it may at some point start to impact public resources and what public resources could be used for. And then the final thing is the quote unquote AI revolution, that I have no prediction about. I am as confused as anyone. But if I had to guess, it's probably going to do a lot of disruption, but it probably won't change our basic behaviors. So who knows, right? So what's the bottom line? LA's overall spatial structure is unlikely to change. The major drivers of transit demand give us a very mixed picture. So where do I land? I sort of land on a modest future. I'm going to guess that there will be continued increases in transit ridership, maybe even some increase in market share, given the amount of investment that's being made within public transit in LA County. But I don't see a revolution coming. There will be some areas of strong transit markets in high density areas. But I think we're also up against some of these really interesting longer term challenges, which has to do with the future of work, the gig economy, and how that will affect our sort of long-term location, residential choice and employment choice locations. So that's it from me. I'm closing with a picture of everybody's favorite transit city in Paris. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jen. That was really great. I want to ask you about something about you talked about that I know the least about, and that's agglomeration economies. I mean, one of the arguments generally made about public transit is its two major roles are it allows large agglomerations of economic activity to function effectively. It's difficult to serve with all single passenger automobiles. And the second thing is to provide, an alternative to driving mobility for those without. And as I understand it, there's been sort of a debate in economic geography over the years about the persistence and resilience of agglomeration economies in the face of the ICT revolution. Yes. And yes. The various arguments for the friction of distance keep weakening. Yes. And yet there was this really powerful continuation of Silicon Valley being Silicon Valley, or the entertainment industry in Los Angeles, finance in New York, things like that. And I'm wondering, I think about just 40 years ago that telework was just around the corner. We were going to have remote work centers. And over a period of 3.5 decades, we moved from roughly 3% of hours worked at home to 6%. Then the pandemic hit, and we went to
Yes.
somewhere between 50 and 60% for a few
Yes.
months,
Yes.
depending on how you measure it. And now it's somewhere between 25 and 30%.
Yes.
So there was this
Yes.
trauma, this
Mhm.
that dislodged sort of
Right.
what you might call sort of a stickiness.
Mhm.
So you know, you've talked about this. I'm thinking a lot of the functioning agglomeration economies are agglomerations of just the sort of jobs that are most amenable to remote work. And in fact, we see, you know, high degrees of that in many places. The big Google Center is just going to be south of here now. UCLA owns because Google's backed out of it. So do you see if what happens to these agglomerations? Those jobs are still going to be there by various measures of the location of the job. But if someone's coming to that job a couple of days a week, is it fundamentally changing the character of these? And what is it about those agglomeration economies that is now holding things together if so much of that work is being done at home?
Very good question. Let me talk about agglomeration economies first. That is correct. There's been this long running discussion ever since really the 1980s that information and telecommunications was going to be the death knell of agglomeration economies and therefore the death knell of cities, right? We'd all be able to take our laptops and go to the mountains and never come back. It turns out that people who have done some of this work, these kinds of high-tech industries are more dependent on face-to-face than just about anything. And you're kind of seeing that in the kind of debates that are going on within the corporations, right? Who want their employees back, even though the employees don't want to come. And that's why we're sort of ratcheting backwards on the work at home stuff. We did some work to argue that there's two kind of levels of agglomeration economies. The first one is what we call regional. So there's these benefits to being in a big region. So when we talk about especially moving from job to job to job, that's very beneficial for the person. The extreme example, for example, are academic partners, right? If you're an academic partner, there's only a few places in the world you guys can land and have a job in the same place, right? That's the extreme. But the point is that there are these general economies and they go both ways for the population and for the businesses, right? Then there's another level of agglomeration economies that we call sub-regional or local. And that's our explanation for why we have these multiple employment centers, because the level of agglomeration, the value of agglomeration varies according, by different industry sectors. And so for, the greatest law office that has its ear on City Hall, only downtown will do, and that rent they weren't willing to pay. But for some other subdivision or subunit of law, that's not what they need. Therefore, enough, a sort of smaller agglomeration is good enough. And that's kind of the argument that we've made, that we will continue to see these clusters of different sizes and sort of different function. Another thing that you may be thinking about is that where's the limit to what can be done at home? If you're in retail, you can't do that at home. If you're a plumber, you can't do that at home, right? So we all, being academics, we kind of think of the world being capable of working at home, right? Just about everybody could work at home. That's not true. So there's an upper bound to how many people can work at home, if that was part of your question. So, and the last part of your question was, well, if everybody only goes to the office twice a week, is it really the office? So far, in some ways, the answer seems to be yes, in the sense that you still need the face-to-face at some level, or you can't that knowledge function starts to go away. Sorry for the long answer.
Question? Hey, there's a row here. Students, if you have questions,
Yeah, students.
raise your hand. They know that.
Otherwise, faculty will just drone on.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess this is more of a comment based on what you just said, which is that, I mean, I think that you're right. The evidence suggests if people work hybrid, it's still you still get enough face to face to sort of maintain even the within firm agglomerations, right? Like just kind of, you know, 'cause one of the most striking pieces of evidence I encountered that came out of COVID was that in the early years of COVID and the lockdowns and people working at home, senior members of knowledge firms were like more productive than ever.
Yeah.
And so you had this surge of apparent productivity. But what was missed was that they were more productive than ever because if they were in the office, they were actually training the next generation in a lot of informal ways. And then
Yes.
that just didn't happen. And so the productivity harms are kind of on the back end.
Yes.
But I guess if you solve that by going to work 3 days a week, you might keep the productivity, which is probably more important. But then the idea that working from home changes travel behavior really kind of goes out the window because you're not really reducing a whole lot of commuting, particularly if people have relocated as a result of the ability to work from home. I now work a little further from the office or something.
Yeah, yeah. And there was a lot of research that was done on telecommuting with those questions about, okay, so if I only have to go in the office 4 days a week, does that mean I use the fifth day to travel more than I would have otherwise? And the evidence is kind of mixed. Yeah. Students.
I'm still a student. I don't have a question yet. I mean, but my question got scooped up somewhere in Brian's.
Oh.
Okay. So thanks, Jen, for this talk. I wanted to ask you a little more about the polycentricity and how that kind of really explains what we see in LA, because there's lots of other polycentric regions in the world that have really different transportation outcomes, right, and different transportation systems, like even the Randstad that you mentioned. So can you say more about like kind of like how other regions have managed to have not just less driving, but like actually more active transport while maintaining this dispersion of jobs? And then the second question is somewhat unrelated. It's a bit more speculative. It's like, well, have the transportation patterns been so stable because nothing's really changed, right, in the last 30, 40 years, especially infrastructure wise. So like, does that mean like, imagine like some sort of like crash program, like an Anne Hidalgo, like where you like, yeah, close streets, like bus priority, like on every street's bike lanes. Like, what would you think about the impact of that sort of radical plan? Whereas in LA, like we have the same transportation system as you did in 1980s to a rounding error.
Well, you do and you don't. You've greatly
yeah,
you've greatly increased the transit supply.
Rail
transit supply. That's a big change.
Well, relative to its base.
Yeah.
Of zero?
No, but you've done something. Although we have, in this time period, we built the 105 freeway that wasn't there before. The 215. I'm sorry. I guess, it is the 215. We have instituted HOV lanes on many, many facilities. We've done hot lanes on many facilities. So even though the actual right-of-way hasn't changed very much, there's actually been a lot of flux in terms of what's there. So I think I would say that we haven't had a stable system. since 1980. That's what I, it's not that we have doubled the freeway system from 80 to 20, we haven't done that. We doubled it in the years before in 1980. But I think we have, we certainly have made a lot of investments in transportation. Now, the active transportation thing is, that's why I didn't want to go into the policy slide. That was just the acknowledgement. And you're absolutely right. Within these sort of broad strokes, right, you see places that have relatively higher transit use, and you see places that have relatively lower transit use with the same geography, right? And then you ask, well, why is that the case? And often it is the case because of so many different policy interventions of one sort or another. In the Randstad, there's a completely different policy towards automobiles, right? In that area, in that part of the world. There's a completely different history of transportation investment with the restoration of rail systems after World War II, so that the entire recovery of that part of the world was based on rail, not on highway. So there were some of these initial decisions that were made that make things very different. On a more local scale, that's where public policy, I think, has a big role to play. And that's why I said there are high density places that could become very strong transit kind of areas. If you're thinking about, achieving a mode share of 30 or 40%, I'm not sure that could be done even if you closed the streets and made busways and everything else. And maybe, but I think it would be a stretch. And remember that transit use is declining in Europe as well. This is not, it's not unique.
So I get to ask a student question. I'm a student for another few dissertation pages, so I count. Okay, so this is a not excellently formulated question because I'm reaching to create a student question. You mentioned earlier the decline of the agglomeration of the entertainment sector in LA. And obviously aerospace sort of packed up and left as well. And you'd incline that like, even if entertainment continued to slide, that like not much else would change. I'm curious how that makes Southern California different than, let's say, automotive industry agglomeration in Detroit, or even going back further, granted this is pre-automobile, but like textile manufacturing in the medium-sized Northeast cities. I don't think this will happen, but like, let's say entertainment also packs up and leaves because Georgia continues to give them, and Vancouver, better tax incentives. What prevents LA? What would make it so that you think LA continues to not change very much / become a hollowed out city?
It's pretty straightforward. The entertainment industry is less than 10% of the economy here. In your example,
logistics. Do you know what percent is logistics?
Oh, it's bigger. Well, if
Bigger
you
than
look
entertainment?
if you look at international trade,
Yeah.
It's 1/8
Okay.
of the regional economy. The examples that you gave were places that were heavily dependent on one industry. And LA is so diversified. I think that's kind of why it keeps surviving, right? Because, and also you've got the fixed assets of a very educated, diverse, talented population. So those people who are in entertainment now, it's terrible to say, there will be disruptions, but that talent doesn't just go away.
Right.
It gets kind of reused in other forms. And aerospace is right now making something of a comeback because of federal policy. Now, how long it'll last, who knows?
Sure.
But these are things, and because it's such a diversified and huge economy, it can take a lot.
That makes sense. Thank you. Other students who are more solidly in the student category.
Well, congratulations if it's only a fifth paging.
Students, postdoctoral researchers.
No, I'm also trying to conjure up the question, but also I'm kind of reflecting because I did my master's at the other place. And Jen was the very first class that I took there in the transportation introduction class. And remember, in that fall quarter of 2018, when I was your student, your class was about TOD, activity modeling, and things like that. And I'm just thinking now that the years have passed, and since given what you have just mentioned in your lecture, what should this generation of these transportation planners just entering the masters at USC or UCLA be taught? You know, because seems like from what you just described in your lecture, you know, like the underlying the logic or the structure has remained virtually the same in the past 10, 20 years in terms of regional agglomeration, dispersion of jobs, and the role of transit that could possibly play. So yeah, can you reflect on that kind of?
So actually, I think you're taught very well, especially at no, at UCLA is what I was going to say. No, no, I think there's a great program here at UCLA. I think you are being taught the right things to some extent. At least what I see in students is, first of all, difficulty in being able to kind of look at the facts objectively, because it's so easy to prescribe what appears to be a solution to today's problems. So if we talk about sustainability and climate change, the answer is transit, right? If we talk about better mobility for the disadvantaged, the answer is transit. So there's kind of this approach that, you know, sort of in the popular understanding that that transit has the potential to solve these problems. I think it's more important to think about what problems can it solve and which problems are better solved some other way. And if we can get that across to students, I think that would be good. The other thing, and I know UCLA does a great job of this, is to kind of understand the difference between effective public policy and not effective public policy. So you have all heard this in your classes, I am sure. If we want to solve the problem of the automobile, then we need to deal with the automobile, right? We need to deal with the parking issues and the pricing issues and so on and so forth. And I think the more people that go out into the world saying, you know, we really ought to be thinking about this, maybe that over time will kind of inform public policy to make better decisions. The rail system in LA is a politically motivated system, right? We didn't build the subway to the sea first, which is where all the density is, which you saw, right? And it was there in 1980. We didn't do that, right? We built it everywhere. You know, we built the line to Long Beach first because there was a right-of-way available. So if we could spend more time thinking about how to best invest our billions of dollars and get around some of the political challenges, that would be wonderful.
Any questions from students? Students? No students? What about planning commissioners?
Thank you. Jacob Wasserman, Planning Commissioner, City of Santa Monica. I guess the sort of dogma, for lack of a better word, planning in the past generation has been like mixed use. Like, let's do our ground floor retail, our nice apartments above it. And there's a lot of vacant ground floor retail in those buildings now. I guess broadly, like, can the agglomerations that you're talking about, I don't know, like the fashion district in LA or some like really intense job heavy agglomeration work in mixed use, or that just
Yeah.
doesn't
it
agglomerate the
does
same
work,
way?
right? But you do have to have huge numbers, because I think what you're kind of you're reacting to is that retail activity has to have a certain amount of demand to stay in business. And the mistake that most of this mixed use development makes is to think that you could have, a major supermarket and everything else, right, without a large enough market to actually carry the business. So that's kind of the scale economy's problem. And then, the small boutique shops, that's great, but they don't always provide all the sort of everyday things that people would kind of demand. So it's a kind of a mismatch in terms of markets, where you need to have lots and lots of people. That's kind of why it works in New York City, because New York City is so dense. And in these places in LA that have 20,000 people per square mile, yeah.
I'd like to pick up on what you said just now, to think more about how we invest the big amount of money in the future. So when we talk about investment in public transit, there has been the debate on going on about whether to focus more on rail versus bus. And then the argument for bus is that the lower income people ride bus more. But as you showed, the share of lower income households are becoming smaller. Households are getting more cars. If we want people to get more wealthier, and maybe if we expect them to get more cars, does it still make sense to focus on buses?
I'm gonna tell you a little bit of a story. And the little story is that I came here today, and one of the things I did before I left my house was say, I better put my presentation on a thumb drive, just in case anything goes wrong, because I wasn't bringing my laptop, okay? And so I take this thumb drive and I open it up, and what do I see is UCLA 2016 presentation. Why am I bringing this up? The presentation was called Bus versus Rail. And so we had so it was this long, the whole presentation was about this, dilemma about should we do bus or should we do rail? And the short answer is that, to me, that's the wrong conversation. It should be transit service quality. So how do you provide high quality transit service? And in some places that you can justify rail, and in other places you're better off doing something else. And there's also something else beyond buses, right? There's all these experiments now with micro mobility and so on. I think we need to expand our focus in terms of what you think about as collective transportation, sort of for hire transportation. And with all the technology we've got, we should be experimenting even more than we are. So I know that's kind of a non-answer, but I don't think it helps to have two transit modes having to sort of fight each other about resources, because it's a system and it's got to be run as a system. So I probably said that in 2016 too.
Are there any student questions? Okay.
This is a very broad question. For so many things, it seems like the issue is like resistance to change from everyone. How has that changed over your career? And what are your best advice of how to overcome just the resistance from everyone about change in their neighborhood or just change in general?
Oh, that's a difficult question.
Sorry.
You're absolutely right. Change is scary to people, any kind of change. And everybody wants things to be just the way they always were. So you kind of have to work hard to show that there's a benefit. Usually it's easier to accomplish something if you can show someone that there's value to them in that change somehow or another. I'm going to give you a real world example actually from a person who is in charge of the bikeway program in the city of Long Beach. And I had him come to talk to my class this semester because what we were doing is not relevant to the question here. So Long Beach has taken a very interesting approach to their bikeway system. They've what I would call opportunistic bikeways. So wherever, with no controversy, they could add some bikeway, that's what they did, right? And people were kind of saying, what are you doing? You have 2 blocks of bikeway over here and half a mile over there, and none of this makes sense, right? But what they were doing was, wherever they could, with no controversy, build the bikeway. Now they're connecting it. And so their argument is, if we just take these 2 blocks, we can now connect this piece of the bikeway and that piece of the bikeway. And, it's not going to really affect your storefront very much because, we're only taking 2 parking spaces and you're liable to get more bike traffic coming by and so on and so forth. So they're actually being amazingly successful with this strategy of do what you can, right? And then sell the value added piece to be able to continue. So I was very impressed with what they were doing.
Thanks. So final question, which is more about research. So, I mean, you've been doing this for a while, right? But imagine, like this is you're reincarnated and you're just starting your PhD next year. What are you going to do your PhD on?
What do another PhD.
What research question is most interesting to you right now? I guess there's another way of putting that.
Well, let's see. In the area of passenger transport, I'm just really interested in the effects of e-commerce and how people's shopping behavior and consuming behavior has changed and what implications that has. So if I had to do a dissertation again, I probably would choose that, or I would choose work at home to see where it's going.
Well, maybe somebody will do that dissertation and then you can buy it from the internet.
I can get it through ChatGPT.
Well, please join me in thanking Debbie for that. I can't think of a better way to wrap up our series on LA's transportation past, present, and future than this lecture. This is the end of the series, but it's not the end of transportation in Los Angeles or transportation research at either UCLA or USC. I can say it. We work very well with USC Metrans, and sometimes we pretend that there's a rivalry. And I do believe there exists a rivalry outside of the transportation research realm. I've seen evidence. So if you are interested in transportation in LA, keep studying it or join the UCLA ITS mailing list, or preferably both. And then you'll keep in touch. Thank you, Jen.
Okay, thank you.